The first thing Staff Sergeant Nyla Cress noticed when she stepped off the Chinook at Forward Operating Base Kestrel was the silence that followed her name. Colonel Harwick had read it off the manifest. Cress Nyla J., Forward Reconnaissance, Attached 3rd Battalion. And the silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough for her to see Sergeant Major Tolliver glance sideways at the man beside him. Long enough to see that man, a captain named Drexler, look down at his clipboard and then back up at her with an expression that was not quite a smirk and was not quite anything else either. It was the expression of a man recalculating. She had seen that expression before. She had been seeing it for 11 years. Cress set her pack down on the packed dirt and looked out at the valley below the base. The mountains in Afghanistan's Paktika province rose in layers, gray and brown, and at the upper ridges, a pale, almost greenish-white, where the snow had not yet melted in late April. The air was thinner than she expected. The wind was not. She noted the smirk, and she noted the man behind it, and she filed both away. Drexler ran the morning briefings. He was a good-looking man in the way that some officers were, squared jaw, pressed uniform even in the field, the kind of voice that carries without effort. He had been at Kestrel for 8 months and had the casual authority of someone who believed his expertise was self-evident. On her second morning, he handed her a satellite image of a ridge system 7 kilometers northeast of the base. "We've had IED activity along the eastern supply route," he said, not looking at her. 3 incidents in 6 weeks. We think they're staging from somewhere up in the Sherikhan Ridge. Probably a small cell, 2 to 4 fighters rotating out every few days, so we can't track the pattern. Cress studied the image. The ridge had 3 viable positions. She could see that without being told. A wide shelf on the southern face, a narrower outcrop further east, and a third position that was less obvious, tucked behind a rock formation that would make it invisible from below, but offered a clean sightline down to the route. "That third position," she said, pointing, "northeast of the formation. They're using that one." Drexler looked at her. "That position's too exposed to wind shear at that elevation. Fighters wouldn't hold there." "They would if they were patient," Cress said. He took the photograph back. "We'll run reconnaissance on all 3. Standard sweep." She did not argue. She had not been there long enough to argue. Instead, she went to dinner, ate, came back to the briefing room after midnight, and spent 2 hours with the topographic data until she was certain she was right. The wind at that third position would be manageable before 0800. After that, not ideal. But a cell rotating in before dawn, placing their devices, and rotating out by mid-morning. They would never notice. She wrote up her assessment and submitted it through the proper channels. It came back the next afternoon with a single line from Drexler. Noted, proceed with standard sweep. Tolliver was the one who actually talked to her, which she appreciated, even if the conversations were not always comfortable. He was a broad-shouldered man from somewhere in Georgia. She could hear it in the way he stretched certain vowels. And he had been in the Army for 22 years and had the specific weariness of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things. He found her at the range on her 4th day. She was working through a series of long shots, 500 meters, then 6, adjusting for the wind that came off the ridge in irregular bursts. She had already put 12 rounds within a 4-inch grouping at 650 when Tolliver arrived. He stood behind her and watched for a while without saying anything. When she stood up, he said, "Where'd you train?" "Fort Bragg, then a program in Quantico. Before that, grew up in northern Manitoba. My father ran trap lines. He started taking me out with him when I was 8. Tolliver nodded slowly. "That's a long way from here." "Yes, Sergeant Major." He looked out at the range. "Drexler's good at his job," he said, in the particular tone of a man saying something he believes is true but also knows is incomplete. "He just doesn't like variables he hasn't planned for." Cress looked at him. "And I'm a variable." Tolliver almost smiled. "You're a staff sergeant with a rifle qualification score that I've seen maybe 3 times in 22 years so." He picked up one of her spent casings, turned it over in his hand, set it back down. "Give it time." The first incident happened 17 days after she arrived. A supply convoy was moving along the eastern route at 0640 when the lead vehicle hit a pressure plate. No fatalities, but the driver lost 2 fingers on his right hand, and the vehicle was disabled for 4 hours while engineers cleared the surrounding area. 2 more devices were found within 30 meters of the first. Drexler's team had swept the Sherikhan Ridge the week before and found nothing at the first 2 positions. No one had checked the third. Cress said nothing about this in the debrief. She sat at the table and listened and kept her expression still, which was something she was good at. And when Drexler asked for input on revised patrol patterns, she offered 3 concrete suggestions that he incorporated without acknowledging where they came from. After the debrief, she went back to her quarters and sat on the edge of her cot for a while. She was not angry. Anger was not something she permitted herself much of, not in the field. What she felt was more like a sharpening. The same feeling she got when the wind changed unexpectedly and she had to recalculate in real time. It was the feeling of knowing something precisely. She knew what was on that ridge. She also knew that no one was going to let her go find it until they ran out of other options, so she waited. There was another member of the unit she paid attention to, a younger man named Sewell, barely 23, who had arrived at Kestrel 2 weeks before her. He was from somewhere outside of Halifax and had the slightly apologetic quality of someone who had spent their whole life being the smallest person in the room and had made peace with it. He treated her with a straightforward decency that was in its own way more notable than any of the sideways glances she'd been cataloging. Sewell was not a sniper. He was a signals intelligence specialist, which meant he spent most of his time in a prefab building full of equipment that hummed and smelled faintly of solder. But he was sharp and he was curious, and one evening he knocked on the doorframe of the briefing room where she was working. "You mind if I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why do you keep looking at that third position on the Shere Khan image?" She looked at him. He was holding a coffee mug and looking at the topographic map she had pinned to the corkboard. "Because I think that's where they're staging from," she said. "You put that in your assessment?" "I did." He looked at the map for a moment. Drexler said the wind shear makes it non-viable. "He's not wrong about the wind. He's wrong about the conclusion." Sewell thought about this. "What do you need?" "I need someone with the signals equipment to tell me if there's been any transmission activity from that grid reference. Specifically, before the 800 on any of the days preceding an IED incident." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I can run a passive analysis on the archived signals data. It won't take long. You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I want to." The analysis took him 3 days. He brought the results to her on a Tuesday evening. There had been short burst transmissions, low power, encrypted, the kind of thing that wouldn't normally flag in an automated sweep. Originating from a grid reference that was, within acceptable margin of error, the third position on the Shere Khan Ridge. The transmissions had occurred on 6 separate dates. 4 of those dates were within 24 hours of an IED incident on the eastern route. The other 2 coincided with dates when the convoy had taken an alternate route and the device, presumably, had not been triggered. Cress looked at the data for a long time. "Who else has seen this?" she asked. "Just me," Sewell said. "And now you." She thought about the proper channels and what the proper channels had produced so far, and she made a decision. "We take this to Tolliver," she said, "not Drexler." "Tolliver," Sewell nodded. He didn't ask why. Tolliver read the analysis twice. He had the kind of face that gave very little away in the moment, of professional quality developed over decades. But his jaw tightened slightly at the 4th page, where the correlation was clearest. "When did you run this?" he asked Sewell. "Started 3 days ago, Sergeant Major. Off hours. Does Drexler know?" "No." Tolliver set the papers down on his desk. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Cress. "What do you want to do?" "I want 24 hours at an observation point with a sightline to that ridge position. If they're rotating in before 800, I'll see them. If there's activity, I call it in and we respond. If there's nothing, I come back and we go through Drexler with the signals data through normal channels. And if there's something and it goes wrong, then I've given you the grid and you respond without waiting for me." He was quiet again. The hum of the base was audible through the prefab walls. Generators, distant vehicle engines, the ordinary sound of a small military installation settling into the night. "I'll authorize the observation," Tolliver said finally. "You go out at 0330. You take Sewell for communications. You do not engage unless fired upon, understood." He looked at her. "And Cress, you were right about the third position." She did not say, "I know." She said, "Thank you, Sergeant Mage," and picked up her analysis and left. She spent an hour before departure, checking her kit in a way that was, by now, almost entirely unconscious. Rifle clean calibrated, the scope checked and rechecked. She knew the ballistic data for the temperature and altitude so thoroughly she did not need to refer to her notes. She packed the minimum required and was ready 30 minutes early, which was how she was always ready. Sewell met her at the vehicle bay at 0330. He had his communications gear and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is not entirely sure what comes next. "You've done this before?" he asked, not making it sound like a challenge. "Yes," she said. "Okay," he said. And that was all. They moved out in darkness, working their way northeast along a dry riverbed that offered cover and reduced their visible profile. The sky above the mountains was extraordinary. The kind of sky that you only see at altitude, where the stars are less like distant lights and more like something actively present, pressing down through the cold air. She had grown up under a sky like that in the winters in Manitoba, and it was one of the few things she let herself feel rather than simply note. They reached the observation point at 0520. It was a natural depression in the rock at the edge of a slope, offering a clear line of sight across to the Shericon Ridge. And the third position. She set up her rifle and settled in. Sewell positioned himself 6 meters behind her with his communications equipment and said nothing, which was exactly right. At 06:01, she saw movement. 2 figures, moving along the back edge of the ridge shelf. They were dressed in civilian clothing and carrying what appeared at this distance to be ordinary agricultural tools. But their movement was wrong, too deliberate, too aware of the sight lines, the kind of movement that doesn't go with people who think they're alone. At 0629, they reached the third position. One of them crouched and began working. The other faced outward, scanning. Cress had already calculated the distance, 930 meters, and the wind, irregular, coming from the northwest at 11 to 14 kilometers per hour with occasional gusts, and the temperature, 4 degrees, and she was making constant small adjustments as she watched. She keyed the radio. "Kestrel, this is Cress. 2 individuals at grid reference Delta 79er. Possible IED placement. Requesting authorization to observe and report." There was a pause. Then Tolliver's voice. "Copy, Cress. Observe and report. Stand by." She watched. At 0641, the crouching figure stood and moved away from the position. Both individuals began to withdraw toward the back of the ridge, in the direction of a narrow draw that would take them down the far side, away from the base. And then the first figure stopped, looked back, looked directly. She was certain of this at something below him. The eastern supply route. A convoy had departed Kestrel at 0615. It was moving along the eastern route she had known it would be. She watched the figure reach into his jacket. "Kestrel, this is Cress. They're initiating. Request authorization." 2 seconds. 3, the voice that came back was not Tolliver. It was Drexler. "Cress, what is your position? You are not authorized." She had 4 seconds at most. The convoy was still moving. She could see the lead vehicle at the edge of her peripheral vision, moving into the stretch of road below the ridge. She did not think about Drexler. She did not think about authorization or reports or the proper channels or any of the conversations she had been having for 11 years with men who looked at her with that particular expression. She thought about the lead vehicle and the driver and the road. She exhaled. 2 shots, 1 second apart. The figure with the device fell. The second figure ran. She did not fire again. The convoy stopped. Engineers were on the road within 12 minutes. They found the device. A pressure plate connected to a command detonator, positioned beneath a culvert at the exact point where the lead vehicle would have passed. If the initiator had completed the circuit, the blast radius would have taken the lead vehicle completely and likely damaged the second. The second figure was apprehended 40 minutes later in the draw on the far side of the ridge by a quick reaction force that Tolliver had scrambled the moment she'd called it in. Drexler met her at the vehicle bay when she returned. His expression was not the recalculating one this time. It was something she had less experience reading. Not quite anger and not quite respect and not quite anything that had a clean name. "You discharged your weapon without authorization," he said. "I requested authorization and received a non-response during an active threat," she said. "I made the call with the information available." "That's not." "The lead vehicle and its crew are intact," she said. "The device has been recovered. The second subject is in custody. If you want to convene aboard, I'll be there." He looked at her for a long moment. There were 3 other personnel within earshot, she noted. He was aware of this. She was aware that he was aware. He turned and walked away without saying anything else. What happened next happened quickly, the way things tend to when a situation has resolved itself in a way that is difficult to argue with. Sewell's signals analysis was formally submitted and reviewed. It was, as formal documents sometimes are, dry and precise and clear. It showed that the third position had been in use for at least 6 weeks. It showed the correlation with the IED incidents. It showed, without stating it directly, that the position had been identified prior to the first incident and that its viability had been dismissed. There was an internal review. Cress was not present for most of it. She was asked to provide a written account, which she did, factually and without editorializing. Drexler was reassigned to a logistics role at Bagram within the month. No announcement was made. These things rarely were. Tolliver told her about it one evening at the range, where she had gone to work through a series of long shots, as she often did when she had something to think through. "Bagram," she said, "effective the 15th. She nodded and looked down the range. The evening light was changing the color of the mountains, the way it always did at this hour, picking out detail in the rock and snow that the flat afternoon light had not shown. Golds and ochres at the ridge lines, shadow pooling in the draws. "What happens to the intelligence Sewell developed?" she asked. "It's been integrated into the assessment framework for the Eastern route and a few other routes." He paused. "His name is on the report." "It should be," she said. There was one more thing. It came later, 3 weeks after Drexler's departure, during a debrief on a separate matter, and it came from an unexpected direction. The second figure apprehended on the far side of the Sherikon Ridge had been through interrogation and had provided, among other things, information about the network he had been operating with. Then, standard procedure. What was not standard was one of the details buried in the transcript of that interrogation, which Sewell flagged and brought to Cress on a Thursday evening. She read it twice. The financing and direction for the cell operating along the Eastern route had not come from a regional commander, as originally assessed. It had come from a network with ties to a procurement contractor operating out of Kabul. The contractor had, according to the detainee, a specific interest in disrupting supply convoys that were delivering equipment to certain forward bases, equipment that competed, in some indirect way, with materiel the contractor was separately selling. It was not a military operation. It was, at its core, a business decision. Cress sat with this for a while. She thought about the lead vehicle and the driver. She thought about the 3 previous IED incidents and the driver who had lost 2 fingers and the 4 hours of cleared road that had cost the convoy half a day. She thought about how long this had been going on before anyone had looked at the third position. "Does this go anywhere?" she asked. Sewell thought about it. "It's been flagged for further investigation, above our level, meaning it may or may not go anywhere." "Meaning exactly that," he said. She nodded. "There were things you could control and things you could not, and the line between them was something you had to locate carefully and honestly, and then act on the right side of it." "Then we've done what we can," she said. It was not resignation. It was something more precise than that. The specific knowledge of where your reach ends, held without bitterness and without pretense. On her last morning at Kestrel before rotation, 8 weeks after she had arrived and stepped off the Chinook to that particular silence, she went to the range at 0545 before the base was fully awake. She ran through her standard sequence: 300 meters, 450, 600, 800. The early morning light was cold and flat and good for this kind of work, no shimmer, no distortion. She had always preferred the mornings. At 650 meters, she put 10 rounds into a grouping that covered less than 3 inches. She was aware, without looking, that she had an audience. 2 of the junior NCOs had come by, drawn by the sound, and they had been standing behind her since the 500-meter string. She had heard them come up and had not turned around. When she stood and began breaking down her equipment, one of them, a young corporal named Egbert, who had arrived at Kestrel 3 weeks ago and reminded her a little of herself at that age, the watchful quality, said, "Staff Sergeant, how long did it take you to shoot like that?" She thought about Manitoba and the trap lines and her father, who had never once told her that girls did not do this kind of thing. She thought about Fort Bragg and the first range officer who had looked at her scores and then looked at her and then looked at the scores again. She thought about 11 years of that particular expression, the recalculating one, and all the rooms where her assessments had been noted and set aside. A long time, she said, and then it happened all at once. Egbert nodded like he was filing that away somewhere. She finished breaking down her equipment, packed her kit, and walked back toward the base. The sky above the Paktika Mountains was brightening at the eastern rim. The darkness, pulling back from the highest ridges, first the snow and rock catching the light and holding it in a way that had nothing to do with anything tactical and everything to do with simply being what they were, old and enormous and indifferent, and in that indifference, somehow clarifying. She did not look back at the range. She already knew what she had left there.